Good afternoon. I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to release of our biennial report, America's Rental Housing 2026. This edition is the 11th in a series of biennial reports on the state of rental housing that was begun in 2006 to shine a light on the importance of good quality, affordable rental housing for the 46 million households who live in these homes. As you'll hear, at present, rental housing providers face a challenging environment with rising costs of building and operating housing, coupled with weakening demand and, in many places, falling rents. Yet, the affordability challenges facing renters that have built up over time remain stubbornly high, with important consequences for the renters' well-being. We hope the release of this report and the discussions you'll hear this afternoon will bring much-needed attention to these important issues, and more importantly, help spur action by public, private, and nonprofit sectors to help address these challenges. Before turning to today's presentations, there are a few people and organizations I need to thank for making this report and today's event possible. First, I want to thank the Ballmer Group for their funding for the report, without which it would simply not be possible. While the report is the work of the Joint Center staff, we are supported in this effort by dozens of organizations listed in the report that represent a broad cross-section of the rental housing sector who serve on an advisory group to inform and review our work. They donate their time to help ensure the report is fair and accurate, and we are grateful for their partnership. Finally, a big thank you to Whitney Ergotabricki, a senior research associate at the center who led the report team, to Sophia Wadeen, who was a principal researcher on the project, and to all of the research, communications, and administrative staff at the Joint Center who made meaningful contributions in one way or another to bring the report to fruition. Today's event will feature a brief review of key findings from this year's report from my colleague Whitney, and then we'll have a panel discussion of leaders from the worlds of policy, industry, and advocacy, moderated by Rhonda Kaysen, a real estate reporter from the New York Times. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Whitney Ergotabricki, to kick us off with the key findings from this year's report.
Thank you so much, Chris, and welcome to everybody out there. I'm going to share my screen and get things set up just a second here. And thank you so much for being with us for the release today. We're really excited to share some of the findings from this year's report. As always, there's a lot in the report that I'm not going to cover today, but I do want to cover these big takeaways that were sort of headlines this year. And so the first is that we saw demand slowing pretty rapidly over the course of last year. And with that slowing demand and amid an influx of supply, we saw that the rental market was softening. Multifamily construction has started to show signs of cooling, but it does remain pretty elevated. And despite recent market softening, affordability remains a really persistent challenge for millions of renter households across the country. The good thing here, though, is that policy solutions are gaining momentum across the country and at all levels of government. So I'm going to start covering these sort of one by one and show some data behind them. So to start with this theme first of slowing demand, I'm showing data from the professionally managed apartment market. The orange line here is the annual net change in apartment households. So you can think of this as the change in new demand. We saw really big swings in demand over the last 5 years. You see that line going up and down and back up. Household growth was accelerating through the first half of 2025, peaked at a record high of almost 800,000 households added to the apartment market as of the second quarter. And then we saw a pretty sharp demand slowdown as the headwinds increased. So amidst slow job growth, poor consumer sentiment, and then also immigration restrictions and deportations, the growth in apartment households fell to 366,000 by the fourth quarter. Additions to the apartment supply, which are shown on the blue line here, were also decelerating, but by the end of the year, we saw additions to the stock were actually outpacing demand. And then as a result of that, we saw vacancy rates ticking up and seeing more softness in the market. This is again data for the professionally managed apartment market, and this is showing the year-over-year growth in asking rents at the national level. Rent growth flattened out starting in mid-2023 for about 2 years, hovering near zero. It stayed there even as we saw that huge boom in demand, mostly because units were coming online at record levels during the same period, which moderated rent growth. We actually saw asking rents drop by 0.6% at the end of 2025. And that mostly came from negative pressure on rents in the South and the West, which I'm adding on here with these two lines. These are regions where new supply was heavily concentrated, and as you see on the lines, they also had larger rent increases during the pandemic. Some of the largest decreases we saw at the end of the last year were in Austin, as well as in markets in Florida and markets in Colorado. Rent growth has held up a little bit better in the Northeast and the Midwest, which I'm now adding on with this sort of green and orangish line. We saw weakening demand there as well, so slowing demand, which led to some weakening of rent growth. Amid this market weakness, then, we're also seeing a lot of supply in places that has yet to be absorbed, and both of those things are starting to slow construction. I'm showing multifamily trends that come from the US Census Bureau. In this case, multifamily are buildings with at least 2 units, and the orange line here is starts. We saw multifamily starts hit a recent peak in 2022 at almost 550,000 units, which was the highest level in 3.5 decades. Starts fell a bit for a couple years, and then we had another slight uptick in 2025. That put us about a quarter below the recent peak, but we're still at 416,000 multifamily units started as of last year. Private data for the apartment market show a slightly different story. They show a year-over-year drop of 36% in apartment starts. If we look at the blue line, this is the number of units under construction. You can see that that's also dropped pretty rapidly from just under 1 million to under 700,000, which is still very high in historical terms as we look across. That pipeline is also keeping completions high despite a sharp drop this year. I'm going to add that on as this green line here. This is apartment completions, or multifamily completions rather. In 2024, we had 608,000 units completed. That was the highest level since 1986. Completions last year fell by about a fifth to a bit under 500,000 in 2025. While we are seeing some market softening, affordability remains a key concern for millions of renters across the country. This is showing the number of cost-burdened households each year. The stacked bars together are the number of households who spend more than 30% of their incomes on rent and utilities each month. On the far right bar, you can see in 2024, there were 22.7 million cost-burdened renter households, which was just a slight increase over the previous year, but marked an increase of 2.3 million since 2019, with major deterioration during the pandemic. We've also seen an increase in cost-burdened households of almost 8 million since 2001 over this longer span of time. The dark blue bars are severely burdened households who spend more than half of their incomes on rent and utilities each month. We're at 12.1 million severely burdened households, basically unchanged from the previous year, but up 1.5 million since 2019 and up 4.6 million since 2001. The orange line here is associated with the right axis. This is the share of renter households who are cost burdened. It ticked down just slightly in this last year to 49%, but as you can see, it's not much movement in recent years, hovering around 50%, but still marks about a 3 percentage point increase since the pandemic. Cost burdens are also rising up the income scale, which is a trend we've been following for a while. And in this case, the chart is showing cost burden shares over time for severe and moderate burdens by income category. If you look clear to the right, this is all households. We can see about half of renters are cost burdened, a quarter are severely burdened. You can see that as a large increase over time. If we then go clear to the left, you can see cost burden rates are always pretty high at the bottom, hovering around 80%, and severe burden is a really high occurrence among this group as well. A lot of the movement in cost burden rates, though, has been in these middle income categories that are sort of around the middle of the renter income distribution. So if you look at households making $30,000 to $45,000, they've had a 15 percentage point increase in their cost burden rate since 2001, and now nearly 3/4 of these renter households are cost burdened. Even more dramatic growth in that next income category over, those making $45,000 to $75,000. Their rate has doubled since 2001, with a 10 percentage point increase since pre-pandemic rates, and now 49% of this group are cost burdened. And then finally, rates are always pretty low at the top, but they've also been rising in recent years. We have 14% of households who make $75,000 or more are now cost burdened, which is a 4 percentage point increase since 2019. So again, we see this rising up the income scale. You'll notice that for some of these higher income categories, though, that the occurrence of severe burdens is much more modest than for the lowest income households. Rising rents have whittled away spending power for many renter households. This is showing the change in median income that's left over after paying rent, which we refer to as the residual income. And it's interpreted as the percent change since 2001. If you look at the green line, these are higher income households. They're breaking about even as compared to 2001, so their spending power is about the same. On the blue line, though, these are households who make $30,000 to $75,000. They've had a 10% drop in their residual income over this period of time. They have about $2,700 per month after paying rent at the median. And then on the orange line, we have a big 60% drop in residual incomes for lower income households, leaving them with just $210 left over at the median. And of course, you see that sharp decrease following the pandemic. With so little left over, especially for these lower income households, it forces trade-offs in basic needs that have a lot of downstream consequences for the health and well-being of these households as well as for the communities that they live in. That's going to be made even worse as we're seeing cuts to Medicaid and SNAP take effect. And of course, inflation has also made the cost of other goods more expensive, which puts households in a more difficult position. The good news is that amidst all these major affordability challenges, we are seeing some policy momentum at all levels of government. And I'm going to start with federal policy first. We saw in the July reconciliation bill a permanent increase in allocations for the low-income housing tax credit, an increase of about 12%. There were additional provisions in that bill, and together with the increased allocations, those should support an additional 1.2 million units. The HUD budget also increased despite calls that it gets severe cuts, and that included an additional $2.4 billion for tenant-based rental assistance, which should help keep up with some of the rising program costs, and that program is considered fully funded. We've also seen major pieces of legislation introduced last year with bipartisan support in both the House and Senate. We had big news just today that the Senate just this morning passed the 21st Century Road to Housing Act by a pretty wide margin. It combines the two pieces of legislation and has elements that aim to increase supply, expand support for home repair and disaster recovery, and reform federal programs. But it does also include a newer provision that would potentially affect the single-family rental supply. At the state level, one of the biggest things we're seeing are zoning reforms that are becoming more popular. And these really aim to remove barriers to small multifamily housing and also to make it easier to permit different types of housing by right. The chart is showing just a sample of states that have had recent preemptions that could help increase the rental supply. And you'll see Oregon is up there at the top. They were one of the first big movers to allow multifamily housing broadly. There were several laws passed in the last year, though, including statewide legislation that allows multifamily construction more broadly in Florida, Maine, New Hampshire, and Texas. But really what we see is a mix of states all trying different things, attempting to remove barriers to supply and increase affordability in turn. At the state and local level, we're also seeing places raising funding from a variety of sources. They're creating mixed income development models to increase the supply. They're also implementing policies to better support tenants. Those are the key takeaways from this year's report. I'd like to invite you to check out the full report on our website. The website also has interactive figures and data tables. We try to provide anything on the themes that we present at the state and metro level so you can understand what's happening in your own space. I want to thank, as Chris did, the entire JCHS team, and especially Sophia Woodine. It's really a team effort to make this all possible, and I really appreciate the contributions of our whole team. I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. I'm excited to welcome our panelists and also turn things over to our moderator, Rhonda Kaysen, who is a real estate reporter for the New York Times.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today and for the wonderful report that Whitney just gave. I'm Rhonda Kaysen, a real estate reporter at the New York Times, and I'm excited to be here today to dig into this report with a few people who have some unique and valuable perspectives on rental housing. So let me introduce our panelists, and their full bios are available on the center's website. Chris Herbert is the managing director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, the research center at Harvard that produced the report that we're talking about today. Sue Ansell is the president and CEO of Gables Residential. Lachelle Dosher is the CEO of the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities, and Mike Johnston is the mayor of Denver. So thank you all for being here. And a quick reminder for those of you watching, for everyone, that you can download the report and view the data and interactives on the website. So Chris, to start things off, the new report shows this paradox. Even as household growth has slowed, as we've put on new supply, there's a record 22.7 million renters who are still struggling to pay their bills. Can you help us understand this disconnect and why is this problem so hard to solve? Why are rents sort of punishingly hard for people?
Yes, thanks, Rhonda. It does seem like the headline of saying that the rental market is seeing flat rents, vacancies rising, should be good news for renters, and yet it doesn't seem to be. Part of the reason is just that what we see over time is that rents escalate, it increases the unaffordability, and then during periods like now, things don't get worse, but they actually don't get much better. And why is that? I think it really comes down to the cruel math of housing is expensive to produce. And particularly what we've seen over the last 5 years, it's gotten more expensive, not just to build housing, but to operate housing. So if you look at the cost of construction materials over the last 5 years, inflation has been 20 or 30% in many of those materials. That rate of inflation has slowed, but we're not giving back those prices to where they were. The cost of capital is much more expensive than it used to be. The cost of land is much more expensive than it used to be. And then once you get that building up and running, the cost of insurance, the cost of taxes, the cost of utilities are higher than they were. So we have kind of a floor beyond which it's hard to get rents down because if developers such as Sue Ansel, who's here with us, can't cover their costs, they can't build that housing. And so what we're starting to see, as Whitney showed, is new construction is slowing because things aren't penciling out. And so what we really have to do is lean into two things. One is how do we build housing more affordably? And the zoning reforms and other things we're seeing will help. But also, I think we have to, as a society, think about how do we channel more subsidies to help people afford housing who can't otherwise.
Thank you. And Mayor Johnson, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Denver. And Denver is a city that I'm sure is feeling that pressure firsthand. And oh, we got a little background noise here. So you were trying out a new tax rebate pilot to get developers to build middle income housing for people who are making between $60,000 and $100,000 a year. I wanted to ask you if you could sort of expand on how you came to that strategy and how it's working for the city, as I'm sure many cities are facing, there are issues with, budget shortfalls and other pressures. So how does that work as a way to address the crisis?
You bet. And thank you so much for having me. Delighted to be here and agree with you entirely, Rhonda. This was one where we knew it was urgent for us to bring on a lot more units of housing and to bring on units that we knew would be affordable so that folks aren't paying more than 30% of what they make to rent. As what I found compelling in some of the data that you saw was that now about 72% of Denverites or people anywhere in the country who are making minimum wage and working full time will still be rent burdened right now, 72%. And so that means we have a real lack of affordable units there. And so what we did is knowing we didn't have a lot of new revenue to use in economic hard times, we wanted to create an incentive to partner with developers to encourage them to bring on affordable units. So we worked with our housing authority and we create a specific limited partnership, an SLP, that provides a property tax abatement to folks who are willing to build deed restricted affordable units. And often the property tax abatement might be 10 or 12 years, but we get a deed restricted unit that comes for 30 or more years. And so it's a huge win for us. And we have almost 1,200 units that came on in 1 year alone of new units in the pipeline to do that. So it's been a really effective way for us to bring on another 1,200 units of affordable housing without any revenue. So we will continue that again this year. And we believe we can add 1,000 to 1,500 units into the pipeline every year with that strategy, as well as a set of other strategies we're using to try to bring on more housing.
That's great. And Sue, I wanted to bring you into the conversation and maybe build a little on what Chris mentioned. He talked about the supply chain issues, the like ongoing building cost issues. There's also now, I'm sure, construction labor shortages that are happening in cities. Can you tell me a little bit about the challenges that developers and operators of multifamily housing are facing when you're building constructing new buildings, but also operating expenses in this economy? And as the report showed, construction materials are up 42% since 2020, and property insurance has doubled. How do you pencil this out without passing everything on to the renters?
Well, it is. Thank you for the invitation to be here. And it is a challenge indeed, for sure. So I think one of the most important things to understand about today's cost environment is that a large share of the increases are structural. They're just not cyclical. So according to a recent report that was put out by NMHC and NAHB, it was a cost regulation study, and the government regulations now account for over 40% of the total cost of developing a new apartment community. And building code changes alone represent more than 11% of those development costs. What was alluded to by Whitney, and you put a great article out about it. I think it was today or yesterday. I'm not sure what I read it this morning, but what's encouraging is that we're seeing policymakers are increasingly recognizing that there's really a connection between regulation and cost and affordability. And so, while I would say, and Whitney alluded to it, the most recent version of the Senate's bipartisan 21st Century Road Housing Act has some challenges with respect to the development of build-to-rent communities and single-family communities. Really, the balance of the bill explicitly aims to cut red tape, streamline reviews, lower regulatory barriers, and make housing less expensive to build. And many of the provisions focus on accelerating permitting, modernizing zoning frameworks, and reducing duplicative requirements that add costs without improving the incomes. And as mentioned, that bill got passed this morning. The House had already passed the Housing for 21st Century Act, which raised the FHA multifamily loan limit to better reflect today's construction costs. It expands planning and community development tools to support new housing supply. And really taken together, these bills signal what I think is a growing understanding that we can't solve affordability without addressing the cost drivers embedded in the development process itself. You also mentioned that, in addition to the insurance costs, operating costs at the community level continue to be impacted by payroll, maintenance, marketing, and administrative expenses. And these increasing costs make it a real challenge to running these communities. And as a result, what we are seeing in the industry is that the operators are really trying to use technology and different tools to find more efficient ways to manage the assets. All that said, it is a conundrum, but we are all in locked arms to try to find solutions to make housing more affordable.
And Sue, actually, I just want to follow up on about the bill that just made through the Senate today, which is, it was exciting to see that news happen. Do you think that it goes far enough? Do you think that are there enough things in there that you see as real tools that you can use that would get you building faster?
Look, I think there will be a reconciliation process between the two bills to see what really comes out of it. But I think everything that we can do that's incremental in this regard will help. Will it solve the issue? No, but any steps forward, I think, will really help.
Okay, thank you so much. And Lachelle, to bring you into the conversation, the public sector is squeezed as well. And the report notes that only 1 in 4 eligible renters actually gets federal assistance. And so how are public housing authorities managing this sort of massive gap between the people who need the help and the resources that you have? And maybe actually, in thinking about that, I would love to hear your thoughts on also on the bill and whether, since there was a lot of attention to HUD in the legislation.
Well, thank you so much for that question. So all of the things that Chris and Sue are talking about really impact housing authorities as well, because we have to stretch every dollar as far as it will go, but we're not magicians. So we've suffered from chronic disinvestment for decades. So sometimes people will say, my gosh, look at public housing. Well, it's really because we haven't had the resources that we need to maintain and keep public housing, but that's really critical because we cannot lose any of the affordable housing that we have. So what housing authorities have had to do is to really transform from just managing public housing to becoming housing developers. So they have entered that field to create additional units, to improve the units that they have. And so through public-private partnerships and looking at what we call lasagna funding, which means you got a lot of different types of funding that you have to bring to the table to make it all happen. That's really where they've had to pivot and shift. But the same type of dynamics that Sue was talking about impact public housing and makes it very, very difficult because we are completely dependent, for the most part, of the funds that come from the federal government.
Thank you. And Chris, when the safety net for public support fails, we see the results of the data. And the report highlights what I saw as a really sobering milestone. Homelessness has reached a record high of over 771,000 people in 2024. What does the data like? Help me understand what the data is showing me and what's sort of driving the surge in homelessness.
Sure. It is a very, very concerning issue, and one that is also visible to many of us as we walk through the streets of our communities, and it confronts us directly. What led to that massive increase in 2024, and admittedly the data is a year old or more now, and we'll hopefully get updated data on it soon. But really two things, and I think the one thing is that there's really strong research that documents a strong relationship between the level of rents and the degree of homelessness. And essentially, it comes down to the fact that when rents are too high, people are just one disaster away in their life, losing their job, getting sick, divorce. One of those things happens, and suddenly you have no safety net to fall back on. If rents are lower, then you might be able to squeeze it out. But when they get higher and higher, that safety net is just not there. And so there was no surprise in some respects in 2024, after coming through a period where rents were going up by double digits during that period of the pandemic, that we saw this massive increase in homelessness. The other thing that was happening, obviously, in 2024 was that there was a large surge of immigrants, of asylum seekers, and that affected a number of places where, in particular, we saw that in an increase in sheltered homeless, folks who were coming in family situations who were then landing in shelters. That was temporary, but the massive amount of homelessness that also came as a result of the housing market conditions is also behind it, and that's not going away. The other factor that played in 2024 were things like the Lahaina fires in Hawaii and other places. Large-scale disasters like we had in Altadena last year in California will also increase homelessness as well. What I would expect to see in the 2025 number is some retreat from that number. But I think we become inured. We say, oh, well, it's down from that level of 770,000. Now it's only 700,000. 700,000 people without a home is a national tragedy. And I know the mayor of Denver has done a fair amount on this, but this is a hugely important issue for us as a society: is how do we help those who are out of other options?
And so, to that point, I went to ask the mayor. You recently shifted Denver's homelessness strategy, closing some temporary shelters like Monroe Village tiny homes to focus heavily on moving people into permanent housing, pairing that with treatment. First, like, what drove that decision and that's change, and how is it working on the ground? Are you seeing an impact? And is it something that's working or something needs modification? Tell me more about it.
Yeah, I mean, we are incredibly encouraged by our progress over the last couple of years. And to Chris's point, even while we've seen numbers go up in across the country, we've seen them really drop dramatically in Denver. So on the first day in office, I declared a state of emergency on homelessness. We've been working relentlessly towards it. We brought on about 1,200 units of transitional housing to get folks off the street and into transitional housing. We've now, over the last 2 years, 24 and 25, delivered a 45% drop in street homelessness and a 25% in overall homelessness, including sheltered homelessness. And that's particularly important because a lot of the folks we moved off of the street moved into transitional housing, which is the right step. It's much safer and more supportive. But that shows up as a sheltered number. So we're both moving them off of the streets and moving them then on into permanent housing. So we've now brought 7,000 people off of the street. We've moved more than 5,000 into permanent housing. We've become the largest city to end the cycle of street homelessness for veterans. So now we don't have any veterans that don't have capacity to access housing in our city. And we've closed all of our large encampments. To Chris's point, it doesn't mean that it's just better for the folks that were experiencing homelessness. It's dramatically better for our residents who now know every sidewalk and public park is open for everybody. So we really believe there is a path. We set an ambitious goal to try to end street homelessness in the first 4 years, and 2 years in, we're halfway there. So we think there is a real path to do that. And you're right, Rhonda, we've also said, as we get more and more folks out of the transitional housing site, our end goal is really permanent housing. And so some of these tiny home villages were designed to be transitional sites. As we bring on more and more permanent housing, we'll move more and more of them into that. And so one of those tiny homes in Monroe is a perfect example. That was an open piece of land the city had. We built tiny homes there for about 4 years. They've been very effective. Now we will close those and build permanent housing on that same site. So in the same way, our folks that were in those tiny homes are now ready to move into permanent homes, it's a perfect time for our city to be ready to move that site from a tiny home village to a permanent affordable housing site.
So tell me more about the site that it'll be. Will it multifamily? Is it supportive housing? Is it a mix, or what kind of house? Tell me a bit about it.
It'll be multifamily affordable housing. It'll probably be about 4 to 6 stories, so it's more gentle density. It's not a huge high rise, but it will have affordability deed restricted units, and that will include some supportive housing and will include some deed restricted but workforce housing at 60 to 80% of AMI also.
Thank you. And so, Lachelle, the report notes a national policy shift away from the sort of housing first model toward approaches that conditionally mandate mental health or addiction treatment for housing. This also was reflected, I believe, in the latest version of the bill we've been talking about. That there was some provisions from the House bill that were removed that were sort of more housing first type policies. So, how does this debate and sort of the direction of the administration impact the day-to-day reality of getting people off the streets and into public housing?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I like to say is that, housing authorities have been tremendous partners working with our COCs and our nonprofit entities, and really are key in terms of moving people off the streets into housing. And the housing first policy approach has been proven to work. I'm not sure exactly why people say that it doesn't, but it does. The treatment first approach, which is what used to be the norm, does not yield a good outcome or result. So before stepping into this role as the CEO, I actually ran a housing authority for a very long time and ran shelters. And so what I saw was that, using housing first and working very closely with your COC, is the pipeline to getting people from that temporary housing that the mayor was talking about into permanent housing. So I really advocate for housing first, but with a little bit of a twist, and that is the robust support services that are needed. If you just put someone in housing who's homeless and you don't give them the wraparound services, what you find is that they will fall out. And then they'll be in a worse situation than when they started. Now they have an eviction on their records. And it's even harder to try and get them back into, the system and moving on towards housing. So I really like to call it a housing first plus, where, you're looking at an individual, you're really determining where is the best placement within your housing continuum, because different people have different needs. So if you do that type of work, you really make sure that those supportive services are very robust. That's how we can really start to implement housing first plus. You heard it here first, and really move towards solving our homeless crisis.
Lachelle, I've heard it. People say too that we say housing first, but it's not only housing. It's housing first, but you also have those other services. And if you don't have those services, then you're not setting people up to succeed. But we often don't fund those the way we should.
Exactly. And that's where the PHA struggle is not receiving enough of the supportive services dollars that are needed to house individuals.
Yeah, and so what is the real world effect for you with this sort of change? I mean, it's like, as you mentioned, it's a reversal to an older philosophy. Like on the ground, how is that playing out in housing authorities? How is that playing out in the public housing sector? Are turning people away? I don't know what's happening.
Yeah, I think it's making it more and more difficult to house individuals. There are people who are homeless, and it's a process. It's a process to really, talk to them and work with them to get them into housing. And if you're making it conditional, then they're not going to come in.
And I know I was going to move on, but I actually want to kind of continue. Mayor Johnson, if you want to jump back into this, like, how did you find, like, how do you sort of persuade people with, from the tiny homes into the housing like, do you find it, how has that worked for you? Like, it's a process, but it sounds like is there some trick that you found that made it more successful than other communities? Those numbers, I mean, 0 for veterans is amazing. Like, how, what was the secret sauce you think you found?
Yeah, I think for us, it was 2 parts. And actually, just quickly to Chris's point, I mean, we were in the unique spot in Denver where we were the largest recipient of migrants per capita of any city in the country. So we had 40,000 newcomers who arrived in our city at the same time that we delivered a 45% drop in street homelessness, which is the largest reduction in street homelessness of any city in American history recorded.
Mhm.
And we at the same time saw the largest drop in the homicide rate and violent crime in our city. So the narrative that newcomers were somehow going to exacerbate homelessness or exacerbate crime, both of those proved to be demonstrably false. And in fact, our city led the country in both of those metrics, even while being a big recipient. But a key for us, Rhonda, was on both fronts. When we were moving folks off the street, some people would say, oh, folks want to be homeless. They enjoy the lifestyle. They're not going to choose housing. What we found is if we offered them a dignified place to go, we literally did not have a single person that said no to moving off the street into our transitional housing when it was non-congregate shelter. It was a room with a lock and a key where you could keep your own stuff. You had access to shower and bathrooms. You had what you needed to be able to be self-sufficient. And we actually had people queuing up to be able to come in. So that was not a challenge. And similarly, when we got folks into those transitional units, they were waiting in line, ready to go into permanent housing. The challenge, as you've mentioned, is just that at the same time, we saw a shortage of federal housing vouchers and state housing vouchers. Our state budget, they helped balance the budget at the state level by also further reducing our voucher count to local cities. So we now have more than enough folks coming off the street in transitional housing. We need to work hard on making more housing exits available as the federal number of exits are reduced. That's why we've tried other things like the SLP partnerships with tax abatements to bring on more units, because we just need more units, not just for folks exiting homelessness, but for teachers and nurses and firefighters and servers in our restaurants who also can't find affordable units in Denver. So our real focus is on clogging that part of the bottleneck is around the units, but we have lots of demand from the street to transitional housing and lots of demand from transitional housing to permanent housing.
That's great. And Sue, to bring you back into the conversation, I want to talk a little bit about supply because, we've sort of had this historic wave of new apartments coming out of the pandemic and it's slowed down, but the national vacancy rate has ticked up to 5.2%. So as an operator, are you having to change your playbook to attract renters who have more options? Do you find that there's certain types of units, it's the top of the market that tends to be the slowest to fill? How does this vacancy rate play into your strategy and your thinking and your long-term thinking about housing and your sort of immediate thinking about it?
Yeah, great questions, Rhonda. Without a doubt, across the nation, we're seeing vacancy tick up in markets where the most supply has been delivered. And so while that means renters have more options than they've had in a while in those markets, it actually also raises the bar for operators to really earn our residents' business. And so operators need to be sharper about how they compete. And for us, what that doesn't mean is it doesn't mean there's a race to bottom on price, but it means we're focusing on what actually matters to renters day to day, which includes fair and transparent pricing, well-maintained homes, responsive service, and communities where people want to stay. Look, at short-term incentives can help someone make a move, but it's really long-term satisfaction that will keep a resident in your community. And concessions may play a role, but they need to be targeted and temporary and not structural. And actually, within our community, within our portfolio, we don't use concessions. We find it's much better to put the rents to market and provide those services. And what we have seen at the same time that vacancies have ticked up a bit, we're actually seeing an increase in our retention rates. And we think, well, that is in large part due to the cost of owning a single family home. It's expensive to move in. But we think it's also really a reaction to what I believe is a focus on the customer experience. And even in this more competitive leasing environment, residents are choosing to renew when they feel like they're taken care of and can see consistent value in their homes. I think about multifamily as really ultimately about creating stable, livable housing over time. Supply cycles will come and go, and the cost to replace housing remains very high. So it's really operators who invest in the resident experience, reliability, and operational consistency, I think, are the ones who will be best positioned to serve our renters well, both now and as the markets evolve.
Do you think this sort of expansion with the trend of people renewing rather than moving, you mentioned the high purchasing costs, but it is also because the rents are sort of staying high that do you get like a better, I imagine that your rent may not increase as much if you stay rather than moving, you're not paying moving costs. Is it so do you see it also as a reflection of a rent burdened population that doesn't have the sort of flexibility to pay for a mover?
I think I think those are all factors, Rhonda.
Hmm.
I don't know that I think that has changed as much, but I think it's really about what options are available to the resident and what best suits their needs. I think there's some that, there is a real cost to move, to your point, emotional, physical, and financial. And so again, I think if you as an operator can provide a safe, secure housing that meets the residents' needs, they will tend to stay with you as long as you can continue to provide that.
Thank you. And Chris, the report points out that we're seeing a historic wave of new, mostly market rate and luxury apartments being completed. So, with the new construction focus on the higher end, how is this influx of sort of high-end supply impacting the overall rent prices and the availability of affordable units on the average renter? You know, is there is sort of a theory that trickles down to the low income, but are tell me more about like the building of the new what expensive units and whether that has any impact on everybody else.
It does. I know trickle down doesn't always have the best reputation. In housing economics, we actually call it filtering. And the
Right.
idea is that when you build, it's expensive to build new housing. And so it tends to get built at the upper end. And if you build enough of it and then you have people move into it. So I'm looking at my options. I see one of Sue's apartments. I move in, I vacate my apartment, and you create this chain of moves. And there's some pretty good research by housing economists that document those chains of moves and find that someone moving into one of Sue's apartments ultimately does free up an apartment down the rent spectrum. Now, the key to filtering is that you have to build enough housing that you get lower vacancy rates. So that puts the downward pressure on prices. We've been building a lot of housing for a number of years now, but for a long time, we're keeping up with demand. As we've noted in the report, we are starting to see vacancy rates have risen, particularly in the South and the West. That has led to rents being lower. And if you look at vacancy rates and rent trends by class, the Class A apartment is where all this new construction is happening, but Class B and Class C are also seeing vacancy rates and vacancy rates rise, rent growth slow. So filtering does work. I will say that if you want to get rents down at the lower or middle part of the market, though, it's more effective if you actually add supply directly in those segments of the market as well. And that requires subsidies. It requires things like Mayor Johnson has done with using tax abatements and other things to be able to incentivize developers and make it feasible for them to build it. So certainly adding luxury housing is an important part of the equation. Adding housing at other points in the spectrum would help all the more too.
And Mayor Johnson, to that point, you have done a lot to cut red tape and try to speed up the permitting process. And you talked about that Denver needs housing. But if you could wave a magic wand and change federal state rules, something that you actually, as mayor, I don't think can directly do, but let's imagine that you could. What do you think would be something that would really help? I mean, is there something that could move things along other than just, you know, building?
It's a great question, Rhonda. I do think every city and state has an obligation to first do everything they can to get out of the way, right? And so our stated goal is we want Denver to be the easiest place to build housing in the country. We want people to want to build here, and so that does mean we focus on things like permitting. We want Sue to want to do business here, and so our permitting before took up to 3 years to get a project through a concept plan, site development plan, and built. I passed an executive order. We took the 280 city employees who worked for 7 different agencies that all touch permitting, put them all under one woman who reports directly to me. And we require that now every single housing project in the city has to be entirely completed in 180 days. And if it's not done in 180 days, we give you your money back on your permitting fees. And within 14 days, you have an immediate appeal directly to me to get the permit approved and to the other members of the executive team. And so that's worked. We haven't had a single project, I think, yet run over the 180 days. So part of it was that was really helpful. And I really would underscore Chris's point that for the first time this year, we've set 2 explicit goals as a city. One on bringing on 2,500 new units of deed restricted affordable housing. So housing targeted directly for affordability. But also we have a goal to bring on 5,000 new permanent units of any income level, because on the moving chain point, we know in Denver it's quite high. The market is so tight. For every unit you bring on, that creates about 0.8 new units of housing across the city. So it's almost a 1-to-1 ratio of a new unit at any scale brings on units across the city. And this strategy for us of all of the above, both more affordable units plus more market units, has meant we've seen our rents at Class C housing drop almost 14%. I think it's the largest drop of any metro area in the country. So it's working to bring on more housing to stabilize and drop those rents. What we would love to see partnership with the federal government on is just a agreed commitment to build more housing, whether that is more dollars, more credits, more vouchers. We would just love to see them focus on a real commitment to doing that. And we would be flexible about what income levels they want to do it at, what conditions they want to put in place. We'd be happy to work around and add our state and local frameworks with that. We just want to see a real focused commitment from them to put dollars and credits and effort behind building the units. And we would love to work with them on that.
Thank you. And Lachelle, I wanted to sort of move off of new construction and talk about the existing home buildings that we already have. The public housing stock needs an estimated $169 billion in preservation funding. What creative solutions are you seeing to preserve older buildings before they're lost to disrepair? And what more could be done?
Well, thank you so much for mentioning that report that came out with the $169.1 billion. If you can believe it or not, for many, many years, over a decade, that number had not been updated by HUD. So, you don't know what you need unless you really can quantify it. So CLAFA, through a lot of partnerships, took on the task of really doing a rigorous study and coming up with, okay, what is the need to preserve all of the public housing throughout the nation? And that's where the $169.1 billion number came from. First, let's figure out exactly what it is. So now the next step in this roadmap that we're working on is creating all of the creative financing tools and how we can really ensure that we're moving in the right direction to solve this problem. Because if you're just focused on creating new, then you're going to be losing them on the back end in terms of preservation. And so the housing stock that we have is so, so valuable. And we cannot ignore the fact that it really needs the infusion of resources. And those are the resources like the mayor was talking about, because when we go in and start doing, a transformation, then we need tax credits. We need project-based vouchers. We need all kinds of different capital to really make sure that we have the resources necessary to preserve what we have. Otherwise, we're just going to fall further and further and further behind.
And at this point, do you see us heading in the wrong direction, or do you see hope toward preservation?
Well, I think in order to be in affordable housing, you got to be an eternal optimist. Otherwise, you would go crazy. So with my optimism hat on, I was encouraged by Congress in terms of the additional monies that were put into tenant-based rental assistance. I was encouraged about now the push for housing for the 21st century, and the work that's going on there. So, but we have to continue to press our legislators the need that we have for the federal funding, because that's one of the key things, when you're putting things together, is to create federal money, state money, and then local money. All of those things come together to really make a project work.
Thank you. And Sue, I wanted to ask you, I want to go back to the bill. There was one provision that I'm sure most people are aware of at this point, which just sort of seems to be a major sticking point, is the caps on build for rent in the piece about the legislation about private equity. It puts, for those of you who haven't read the bill, as it now stands, builders would be allowed to continue to build single family for rent as new build, but there's a 7-year cap, at which point they have to sell. What do you make of it from a builder? Like, does that still work? Does that still pencil out? Are there concerns about that? Is it a reason for worry?
Yeah, I see that as very difficult. I think that will really make it very difficult to build and finance build to rent communities. I think build to rent communities, homes that are single family homes, as you think about them, that are built to rent, can create a real solution from an affordability standpoint. And I think by putting this regulation that you are the owner, the builder is required to sell in 7 years will make it very difficult to finance. And most of the investments that are going into this kind of activity are a longer term investment than just that 7 years. So it provides some real challenges. There's also some language in there about institutional ownership of single family homes. I think we need to do a better job educating our legislators and administration. There is really not very much of that. The imagined level of activity in that regard is overestimated. And so if I could wave my magic wand as I look at those two bills coming through reconciliation, I would hope that we could make some real progress there, because I do think the way that the Senate bill is currently drafted will effectively make it nearly impossible to add to our housing stock with a build to rent solution. And I find that we talked a little bit earlier about the difficulty of moving from an apartment community from a cost standpoint to a single family home. I think a build to rent community is a very nice bridge. At some point in people's lives, they have more children or they get married and they need more space or want more space than you can find in a traditional multifamily home. And the build to rent community provides a really nice solution for that, which again adds stock and helps all of this as we talked, as Chris spoke about filtering.
Thank you. And since we have a little more time, I wanted to ask all the panelists about climate change. And so we'll start with you, Sue, since I've got you here.
Sure.
Tell me, how are you thinking about climate in terms of, there's a couple of factors, so maybe if you can touch on is insurance, if you want to, like, how does it affect your insurance, but how does it affect like where you build and how you build and how much it costs to build? How do you think about sort of building in a changing climate?
Yeah, it's something we pay close attention to. And for us, especially on new construction, sustainability, investing in sustainability really isn't about doing something extra. It's more about being smart and a responsible operator. We typically tend to own our communities for a long period of time. And so decisions that we make, investments that we make in sustainability can really lower our long-term operating costs and make the community more reliable. So that extends the useful life of our buildings, which is fantastic. I think it's important also to preserve and upgrade older buildings, but that is frankly much harder to do and very expensive, yet it's probably less expensive than trying to build new affordable homes. So I don't have the solution to that yet, but it is important, because every existing apartment that we can maintain and improve, it's going to support, the long-term housing availability, especially in markets where it's where new construction is so expensive to do. I would tell you, from how we're thinking about it within our communities, wherever possible, we are doing solutions that we think are practical and durable. So that might include, we've integrated solar energy into a number of our communities in the appropriate areas where you can do that. Regulatory environments around the country are quite different. But this really helps balance energy use in shared spaces and lowers operating costs. So that's something that we've done. We also, as we're designing new buildings, we're doing it differently, and we're doing based on what we're learning really from severe weather. So in a flood-prone area or a storm-exposed markets, that may mean elevating critical electrical and mechanical equipment, putting them up on the second floor rather than on the ground floor. It reduces risk and limits disruption. But all these decisions also matter, to your point, because insurance costs are rising sharply, especially in areas that are exposed to weather and risk. And frankly, we've had pretty good experience with all of our communities with a limited number of claims. And so to the extent over the long run that you can reduce the claims, reduce the impact, it's going to help. It's going to help from an insurance standpoint, but it's also going to minimize damage, reduce damage, and minimize disruption.
Thank you. And Lachelle, can you talk to me a little bit about how you think about climate change with the affordable housing stock.
Yes, it's really kind of the same vantage point that Sue was talking about. But I think, our desire is to try and maximize any type of funding sources. Sometimes you have at the state level for green energy and any of those type of improvements. We try and put it in there because we know that it's going to be difficult over the long run in terms of attracting more capital to our projects. So, we're always on the hunt to try and find the financing to make it cheaper and easier to operate. Trying to keep those operating costs down is just absolutely critical to the long-term sustainability of the projects. And we're also very, very concerned, nationally about the rising cost of insurance. We have some areas in the country they just can't get insurance at all. So we're in danger of losing, precious housing resources because of the severe challenges that these housing authorities are facing, depending on where they're located. But yes, it's the same type of thing. We are trying to make sure that we use every single resource available to green our properties.
And Mayor Johnson, Denver recently opened the Irving, which is an all-electric, permanently affordable housing community. Can you tell me a little bit more about how crucial is local and state climate funding for this to getting these green affordable projects done, especially when there is a shortage of money coming from the federal level?
Yeah, we are a strong believer in Denver that we can be both pro-climate and pro-growth, and then particularly pro-climate and pro-affordability. And so Shell's right, it's a hard compromise to find, but we're trying to keep both of those values front and center. And so we are fortunate that we went to our voters about 4 years ago to create a voter-approved climate action fund, which is about $50 million a year that we can use to invest in climate strategies. And we know about half of the total carbon emissions in the city are coming from buildings. And so wherever we can make them more efficient, we want to, and that includes a push to have all of our buildings be powered by electricity. So we're moving to not have any new gas or space heating be done by fossil fuels, but by electric sources. And our grid's about 80% renewable now on wind and solar combined. And so our goal is really now to green the grid and then push everything onto electric energy supply. And so we have a city ordinance that requires now that any new commercial buildings will be space and water heater supported by electric, and then we would like to eventually expand that to housing units. But right now it's about both encouraging that where we can, using our climate funds to incentivize affordable housing units to make them electric, and then encouraging more and more homeowners to make that same conversion effort. And we help subsidize those as well.
Great, thank you. And we're almost out of time. And so, Chris, I was hoping maybe you could answer the last question. We've talked about a large range of issues today. We've looked at, and the report covers a lot of headwinds that the rental market is facing. But what sort of gives you optimism in the future, or how are you looking at this going forward? Do you see room for optimism from the trends that you see, from Whitney's findings in the report?
Yeah, and I do. I will say that the Joint Center sometimes gets accused of being the Joint Center for doom and gloom, and that our job is to hold up the challenges we face. But I think one of the things we want to do with this report, and by virtue of having these folks in this panel, is also hold up the reasons for optimism. And certainly, I think we have three folks right here. So, Sue Ansell representing the private sector, and we have a private sector that's strong and robust and can produce good quality housing in large numbers if we let them. We have Lachelle Dozer from the Council of Large Public Housing Authorities. And I think, we could spend a whole session on the history of public housing and its reputation. But Lachelle represents a number of organizations that are very entrepreneurial and doing really good work. I should give a shout out to the Cambridge Housing Authority, the Boston Housing Authority, my backyard, who are doing great entrepreneurial work, the Montgomery County Housing Opportunities Commission. So there's a lot of creativity and energy in the public sector there. And Mayor Johnson, I met him on a panel at the Kennedy School, and he and folks from the Joint, my colleagues in the Joint Center came away feeling very optimistic from all the creative approaches that the mayor and his folks have taken in Denver to addressing homelessness, to building missing middle housing, to using public land. I think, there's an expression that says that necessity is the mother of invention. And we are at a time when there is a lot of experimentation happening on how do we produce housing more efficiently and more cost effectively. but also importantly, how do we pay for it? In Colorado has Prop 123, where they're putting public money into helping to write down the cost of debt and equity for housing. So I'm optimistic because I'm seeing right now is a real period of experimentation and new approaches being tried in the laboratories in the state and local level in public housing and in the private sector. And what we need is a federal partner. We've heard a lot today to help make that go. What we've seen in Congress is that there's a recognition that this is a problem that needs federal attention. Haven't quite got there yet with the checkbook, but I think there's reason to believe that with these successful pilots we're seeing, with this recognition this is a big problem, that we'll see the experimentation today lead to better and more robust solutions in the future. So I am optimistic.
Let's move on that note. I want to thank everyone in the audience for coming. We are out of time. I obviously want to thank Chris and Whitney and everyone at the center for putting together this incredible report that journalists rely on every day. So thank you so much. And I want to thank all our panelists for joining us today and giving us their time. So like a virtual thank you all around, and have a good evening, everyone. Take care.
Thanks so much.